For centuries, the story of King Richard III lived in a strange space between history and mythology, carved.
For over 500 years, history told us who had the right to rule England. But buried beneath a parking lot, a king's bones told a different story. Because when scientists tested the DNA of King Richard III, they uncovered a secret so destabilizing it quietly collapses the idea of royal blood itself. For more than 5 centuries, King Richard III existed in 2 places at once. On the page, he was a monster. In the ground, he was missing. History books said he fell at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, cut down in the mud, his crown lost, his body dragged away. They said he was buried in a friary in Leicester. Then the friary vanished, torn down, built over, forgotten. Over time, the story darkened. Some whispered his bones were dug up and thrown into a river. Others claimed he never had a proper grave at all. The thing nobody tells you is how dangerous a missing king can be. Without a body, legends grow, and Richard's enemies filled that silence fast. He became a symbol of evil, a twisted tyrant, a hunchback villain, frozen in Shakespeare's words. But no one could prove it, because no one could find him. Then, in 2012, something unlikely happened. Not in a cathedral, not in a palace, but in a city council car park. Beneath layers of asphalt, archaeologists began digging where old maps hinted a friary once stood. Most expected rubble, maybe a wall. No one expected a skeleton, and certainly not that skeleton. It lay exactly where a king should be buried, in the choir. Not hidden, not dumped, but placed deliberately. The bones were damaged, scarred, violent, the kind of damage only a battlefield could leave behind, and the spine curved in a way that made one shoulder higher than the other. Suddenly, the myths had a physical shape. But this was only the beginning, because finding the bones didn't just raise one question, it raised a far more dangerous one. What if history hadn't just misjudged Richard III? What if it had covered something up? At first, the skeleton was just called Skeleton 1. No crown, no name, no certainty. But the bones refused to stay silent. The man was in his early 30s. Richard III was 32 when he died. The injuries told a brutal story. More than 10 wounds, most of them to the skull, deep cuts from bladed weapons, blows that came from above, some so vicious they could only have landed after his helmet was torn away. This wasn't an execution, it was a final stand. Then there was the spine, a sharp S-shaped curve, severe scoliosis, not a hunchback, but a real visible condition, one shoulder higher than the other. Suddenly, the myths had a physical shape. But this was only the beginning, because finding the bones didn't just raise one question, it raised a far more dangerous one. What if history hadn't just misjudged Richard III? What if it had covered something up? At first, the skeleton was just called Skeleton 1. No crown, no name, no certainty. But the bones refused to stay silent. The man was in his early 30s. Richard III was 32 when he died. The injuries told a brutal story. More than 10 wounds, most of them to the skull, deep cuts from bladed weapons, blows that came from above, some so vicious they could only have landed after his helmet was torn away. This wasn't an execution, it was a final stand. Then there was the spine, a sharp S-shaped curve, severe scoliosis, not a hunchback, but a real visible condition, one shoulder higher than the other. Suddenly, the myths had a physical shape. But this was only the beginning, because finding the bones didn't just raise one question, it raised a far more dangerous one. What if history hadn't just misjudged Richard III? What if it had covered something up? To prove the skeleton was Richard III, scientists needed DNA that had survived 5 centuries underground, moist soil, bacteria, time, every enemy of preservation. One wrong touch could erase the signal forever. And even if they succeeded, there was another problem. Richard III had no direct descendants, so the scientists went sideways through history. They turned to mitochondrial DNA, a quiet kind of inheritance passed from mother to child, unchanged across generations. It doesn't care about titles, or crowns, or wars. It just keeps going. Genealogists traced Richard's family through his sister, Anne of York, one woman to the next, across 19 generations, through forgotten marriages, name changes, and continents. Most family trees collapse after 3 or 4 generations. This one crossed half a millennium. At the end of the line were 2 living people, ordinary lives, no thrones, no castles. Their DNA was tested. When the results came back, the match was exact, not close, not probable, identical. The odds of coincidence were beyond remote. This wasn't guesswork, it was confirmation. In February 2013, the announcement was made. The skeleton in the car park was King Richard III, beyond reasonable doubt. History had found its missing king. But the thing nobody tells you is that this wasn't the most important test. Because while mitochondrial DNA confirmed who Richard was, another strand of DNA was about to question who he should have been. A test that followed not the mother's line, but the father's, the Y chromosome. And when scientists compared that result to living male descendants of the Plantagenet line, the story didn't line up, not even close. This time, the DNA didn't confirm history, it contradicted it. The Y chromosome is supposed to be simple. It passes from father to son, name to name, crown to crown. If royal blood meant anything, this was it. Scientists traced living men who descended through the male Plantagenet line back to Edward III. Their family records were solid, their lineage accepted by historians for centuries. If Richard III truly belonged to this line, his Y chromosome should have matched theirs. The tests came back. It didn't. There was no match, not partial, not close. It was as if the bloodline snapped somewhere in the dark. This wasn't a lab error. The samples were checked, rechecked. The methods were sound. The result stayed the same. Somewhere between Edward III and Richard III, a son had been born to a man who was not his legal father. Scientists call it a false paternity event. History calls it something else, a secret. The thing nobody tells you is how common this actually was. In pre-modern times, false paternity happened often enough that over many generations it becomes likely. But kings didn't rule on probability. They ruled on certainty, on blood, on divine inheritance passed from father to son. And now, DNA was saying that certainty never existed. The implications were explosive. If the break happened early, then generations of kings may have ruled on a claim that was biologically false. If it happened later, then the living descendants, not Richard, were the ones who lost their genetic link. Science couldn't say where the break was, but it didn't need to, because for the first time, the idea of an unbroken royal bloodline was no longer history. It was a myth, and myths don't survive contact with bones. Once the Y chromosome mismatch was revealed, the question quietly changed. It was no longer who Richard III was. It became what made a king legitimate. The thing nobody tells you is that medieval England didn't run on DNA. It ran on power, law, and force. Parliament named kings. Armies kept them there. Blood mattered, but only because people believed it did. And belief is fragile. Richard III's claim came through his father, Richard, Duke of York. That claim traced back to Edward III, just like his rivals in the House of Lancaster. The Wars of the Roses were fought on this very point. 2 families, 1 crown, each insisting their blood was purer than the others. Now, DNA suggested that somewhere in that line, biology stopped matching the story. Here's the uncomfortable part. Even if Richard's biological father wasn't who history recorded, it wouldn't have made him illegal under medieval law. Illegitimacy only mattered if it was proven and declared, and it never was. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor's claim, the man who defeated Richard, was weaker by blood than almost anyone else's. His right to rule came from conquest, from winning, from surviving. So if DNA had existed in 1485, it wouldn't have stopped Richard from being king, and it wouldn't have stopped Henry from taking the crown. What it would have destroyed is the illusion that God chose kings through blood alone, the illusion that wars were fought over something solid, the illusion that lineage was ever clean. Because if royal blood can fracture silently, then every crown rests on a story, not a strand of DNA. And that realization changes everything. But the scandal doesn't end there, because long before science exposed this fracture, people were already whispering about it. The DNA didn't invent the scandal, it resurrected it. Centuries before genetic tests existed, rumors followed Richard III like a shadow. Whispers that his father, the Duke of York, had been away at war when Richard was conceived. Whispers that his mother, Cecily Neville, had been too close to another man. No proof, just gossip. But in medieval politics, gossip was a weapon. Accusing a rival of illegitimacy was one of the fastest ways to poison. Richard's enemies spread these rumors even while he was alive. After his death, they hardened into fact. The Tudor dynasty had every reason to encourage them. Henry VII needed Richard to look unnatural, unfit, unworthy. If Richard was a villain, then Henry was a savior. If Richard was illegitimate, then Henry's victory looked like justice instead of conquest. Shakespeare later sealed the image, a twisted body, a twisted soul. Theater replaced evidence. What makes the DNA discovery unsettling is not that it proves the rumors true. It doesn't. Science cannot tell us where the bloodline broke. It could have been generations earlier. It could have happened after Richard. It could belong to someone history never suspected. But DNA confirms something worse. The rumors were possible. And that means the foundation of royal certainty was always weaker than it appeared. The stories people whispered in taverns and court corridors weren't nonsense. They were reflections of a system that pretended blood was pure, while knowing it never truly was. The bones didn't clear Richard's name, they complicated it. And just as the scandal threatened the past, the skeleton itself began rewriting the man. Because the body under the car park wasn't a monster, it was something far more dangerous to myth, a human being. For centuries, Richard III's body was used as evidence against his soul. A crooked spine became proof of corruption. A physical difference turned into a moral judgment. Shakespeare's Richard limped across the stage as a symbol of evil itself.
But the skeleton told a quieter, harder truth. Yes, the spine was curved, severe scoliosis, one shoulder higher than the other, but there was no withered arm, no twisted limbs, no sign of weakness. The bones showed strong muscle attachments. This was a man who rode, trained, and fought, a man capable of leading soldiers into battle. The thing nobody tells you is how quickly difference becomes propaganda. Richard's condition would have been visible, but it would not have defined him. In life, it made him unusual. In death, it made him useful to his enemies. Chemical traces in his teeth and bones added another layer. They showed where he lived as a child, moving across England as his family's fortunes shifted. They showed how his life changed when he became king. His diet grew richer, luxury meats, seafood, wine in large amounts. This wasn't excess for pleasure alone. It was the visible behavior of power. Then came the face. Using the skull, forensic artists rebuilt him layer by layer. Not a villain, not a monster, a composed man, intelligent eyes, a controlled expression. Early portraits suddenly made sense. For the first time in 500 years, Richard III looked back at the world, not as a symbol, but as a person. And that is what makes the final evidence so unsettling, because the bones that humanized him also recorded his death in brutal detail, and they revealed something history had softened. Richard III didn't flee, he fought. And the way he died forces one last question, not about blood, but about truth. The bones recorded the end with brutal honesty. 9 wounds to the head, blades from above, from behind. One strike sliced away part of the skull, another drove deep into its base. Either could have killed him. His helmet had been torn off. He was on foot, surrounded. This wasn't a king hiding behind men. It was a man refusing to yield. After death, there was no mercy. His body was stripped, likely thrown over a horse, displayed, then buried quickly in a friary, without ceremony. Not hidden, just erased. And for centuries, the story stopped there, until science reopened it. The DNA confirmed his identity. It questioned his blood. It cracked open the myth of royal purity. But it left something far more unsettling behind. If kings were not chosen by blood, and if blood itself was never certain, then what were generations of people really fighting for? The Wars of the Roses were sold as a battle of rightful heirs, of true lines, of God's will made flesh. But the bones whisper a different answer. They suggest power was always decided the same way, by force, by belief, by who survived long enough to tell the story. And that leaves one final question hanging in the air. If Richard III's right to rule rested on a story that biology later unraveled, how many other crowns stand on the same fragile ground? Because somewhere, buried beneath certainty, there may be more bones still waiting to speak. And when they do, history may have to choose which version of the truth it wants to believe.